You're live.
All right, thanks. Welcome back to Senate Economic Development. We are finishing going through the changes that the House has proposed to the CHIP Community Housing Infrastructure Program, and we're beginning to look at drafting an amendment, and let's finish going through the changes, and then we're going to have Keisha, who's been taking a first stab at an amendment, talk to us about it in a minute.
Could I get screen sharing?
Alright.
So, John Gray, Office of Legislative Counsel. I will screen share with you the Representative Kimball et al. Amendment in just a moment, which is the place that we've been using to look at the changes.
Is this the one you were looking at earlier today?
Yes.
It's
3.1.
It's 1.3 draft 1.3 S127.
Okay.
I believe it's
It's
posted.
already
It's posted. Yep. So where we left off, we were in the application section, so section 1910, and I'm on page 11 of this amendment. We were talking about the approval section in our 45-day deadline.
Yeah.
And then the requirements for approval, that you meet the criteria of the section. But the piece I really wanted to draw your attention to at the very end, but didn't get to, was the application deadline that are submitted on or before December 31st, 2031. The Senate version had a sunset proposed of December 31, 2035. So it was a 2-year program, right? This is 6 years. So your CHIP sunset December 31, 2031 shaves off 4 years. The next piece we come to is your subsection H at the bottom of that page 11, and this is your limit. So we've talked a little bit about this before.
Excuse me, John, in all of your TIF work, and this is a question, I guess, for Jessica, is do we have a notion of the average amount of time it takes to get a TIF up and going? Because it would use up pretty much all that time.
Years.
Yeah,
Thank you, Alex.
we just extended one another 2 years. That's been going
we just
for
did Barry's for
a
another
while.
2 years. So, I mean, just as we think about this is definitely a red flag for me, but it just, the notion that we'll even have any sense of a pilot after 5 years is a joke. Okay, thanks.
So your limit, BEPC shall not annually approve more than $40 million in aggregate lifetime education property tax increment retention. Again, lifetime education property tax increment retention is for a project. How much across this retention period, how much education property tax increment would be retained, and you're aggregating for all applicants within that year, and that's what your $40 million figure is. BEPC to not annually approve more than $40 million in that aggregate retention. But note, starting on line 19, that BEPC may increase this limit by not more than $5 million upon application by the governor to an approval of the Joint Fiscal Committee. And evaluating that request, the Joint Fiscal Committee shall consider the economic and fiscal condition of the state, including recent revenue forecasts and budget projections. BEPC to provide testimony, documentation, housing infrastructure, project application data, and any other requested information to demonstrate that increasing the cap will create an opportunity for the creation of additional housing to meet the needs of the munis and the state. So it's a $40 million annual cap, but it can be yearly increased by $5 million under this process. Application by the governor to and approval of the Joint Fiscal Committee.
Can I make sure I understand?
So, yeah, so that could be up to 65 million annually after 5 years.
No, it's each year you would get a 5. It doesn't aggregate over
So
time.
that doesn't aggregate?
It's the maximum yearly amount would be 45 million in any year.
Okay, Keisha.
I need you to square this up with the definition for me again. So the annual approval is for 40 million. And then and then the limit is 6 years.
It's across 6 years. So if you think of it that way, it would be 240 million, right? And then if you got these 5 million extra in a year, you could potentially have more than that. But it's a yearly cap of 40.
Of 40. All projects.
All projects in that year. That's right.
All projects aggregate in 1 year, 40 million. So 5.
So the next year, you'd be
6
starting
years.
from zero again. The next
Right.
year, you would be looking at applicants as they come in, applications as they come in, and you would add up that
So, and it could go up to 45, right, you said?
if they get this JFC approval upon application by the government.
So we're looking at a minimum of 240 million over 6 years.
Well, it is a cap, right?
That's a cap.
Yeah.
That's not, that's
So it's not
not
necessarily
to
what you would actually,
exceed.
Yeah.
And I might normally look at the cost of building one unit of housing and say that's not very much money. But for infrastructure, that's even less
Right.
money. Like
For certain.
like
tasks.
maybe 2 or 3 projects.
Okay. Keep going.
okay. Let's look at my. Trying to find
Page 12, indebtedness.
Yeah, I'm
Especially
I'm
with
trying to find
tariffs.
all the things to flag.
Yeah.
The indebtedness section is, the same, but for one clarifying non-substantive change, which is on page 13, subdivision D. The housing development site shall continue until the date and hour the indebtedness is retired, or if no debt is incurred, the debt incursion period ends. We previously described the termination of a site across 2 different subsections. This just puts it into one subsection, so it's easier to see. It's not a substantive change. But basically, if you have your debt incursion period and you fail to incur any debt, then it's as if the project never existed, right? The site terminates in the same way that it does for a TIF district. You don't incur debt within that period, your TIF district goes away. So just building in that provision here. Alternatively, if you do incur debt, the site won't go away until all the indebtedness is retired for that. So just a clarifying change, not a substantive change. The next piece to jump to is section 1910C. So we can, your whole next section is the same as past the Senate, so determination of OTV and the like. So we can jump all the way to page 16. And these are core differences here, as we were talking about before. So one change you're going to see, and this will be less major than the other change I'm going to point to in a second, but in your subsection A, starting on line 9, there's a sentence that starts, a municipality may provide tax increment. So a muni may provide tax increment to a sponsor only upon receipt of an invoice for payment of the financing, and the sponsor shall confirm to the muni once that tax increment has been applied to the financing. So this is a measure, kind of a housekeeping measure to say only provided upon receipt of a bill from the sponsor, right? Because the muni, if they're relying on the developer as the sponsor, is not going to see that bill, so they just ask for the bill and then they provide the tax increments for that amount. It's trying to protect the muni against oversupplying increment if they don't see it in the bill, right? So this is kind of a housekeeping measure, but the more substantive changes come in the next section, or subsection B. So education property tax increment. This goes back to the discussions around the affordability construct and the incentive structure. So under subdivision 1, you're talking about the normal route that a project that is not trying for anything else, so one that doesn't satisfy the mixed income criterion, what does it get? For a housing infrastructure project that does not satisfy that mixed income criterion, up to 60% of the education property tax increment may be retained for up to 20 years. So that's down from the 80%, what Senator Hinsdale was talking about before. In the Senate version, it had been 80% for those projects. Here, it is down to 60%. And then for projects that satisfy that mixed income criterion, so they meet that extra piece of the application, they can get up to 80%, so they get an extra 20% from that 60%. Or, as you can describe here, they get the amount that the Senate was specifying as the education property tax increment retention.
So does everything remain static if the programs themselves are sunset?
Can you say more? Just
So they'd be approving a project to retain increment for 20 years. The program
Would remain.
sunsets in
Sunsets
6
in
years.
6 years.
So if they sunset both, I don't know who would be managing.
They're still managing, and that's
Who's they? VEPSI.
Betsy. And so that's why the sunset is set up the way that it is, which is an application deadline
Mm-hmm.
rather than a repeal of the chapters, right? Typically, when we sunset, we repeal a program.
Mm-hmm.
This leaves the program on the books. It's just that no more applications come in for review that can't be approved. So Betsy's still out there doing the work that they do. Everyone's still operating the districts that they have, everyone's still running the projects
Just
that
no
they
new
have.
approval.
It's just no new approval.
Yeah, I mean, it's just not how we used to legislate, I feel like, to try and put uncertainty into place 6 years out. It just, call me old school, but, you know, I feel like we keep trying to tie the hands of future legislatures in very problematic ways for the economy.
Sort of like what's happening in Smyrna.
I know.
And of
You know,
course,
it's
if,
just interesting, Mason Ways and Means is having a direct channel with.
I mean, another, you know, potential consequence of this is that if you're a muni who wants to use this program, right, you're gonna wanna rush to get your application in. So what kind of effect that has on application quality and the like.
You're right, in some ways, they're kind of pushing a result they don't want, which is, you know, by forcing everybody to have to focus on it very soon, very fast.
No one can even do that. I mean, municipalities just can't move that quickly.
Nothing moves that. Well,
The other thing that is relevant to this conversation is, right, rulemaking will be undertaken for this program, right? You're not gonna have the full rule set on July 1, 25, right?
Oh, that's
It's gonna take
right.
time to do, so
18 months.
it could be that,
Well, they have it written that nothing can begin until the rules are in place, which, yes.
The sunset's a hard, fast 2030.
No, I'm saying like, there's no reason to do that. We usually don't do that.
so that's a good question. If rulemaking takes 18 months, which it usually takes a year to 18 months, even fast rule maker approvers, there's a hard and fast deadline end here of 35. So I mean,
31,
you're gonna
31.
end up effectively
Yeah,
having
31.
4 years of a program
Or less.
or less.
It's 31, not 35, so I think we should.
No, that's what I mean. I mean, by the time the rules are established, you're looking at 3.5 to 4 years.
There's two ways to get at that. One is extending the deadline, and the other one is to not require everything to be approved and set in stone before you start
Exactly.
making decisions on a rolling basis.
Yeah. Okay, let's keep going.
the next piece on page 17 is your municipal property tax increment. As left the Senate, this was not less than 100% of the muni increment may be retained. Here it's not less than 85%. I would just offer, this is actually just more flexibility for municipalities, right? They could still get 100%. That's what they want. This is just not less than 85%. And something relevant to this is that related costs can include certain municipal expenses that are only to be funded with the municipal property tax increment that is in excess of this specified percentage. So if you had this at 100%, they would never be able to use that provision. But anyway, just to say, I assume this provision is less problematic from the Senate's perspective, but just calling out, there is a difference here, not less than 85% as opposed to not less than 100%. We have the same excess tax mechanics, tax increment mechanics as existed on the Senate side and as exist for TIF districts. But we do have something new here on page 18, and this is section E, adjustment of percentage. This is using a measure that is included for TIF districts, but on a different timeline. So for TIF districts, we authorize, or the state authorizes VEPC to do a check-in at the 10th year following creation, and they can update the increments retained based on how things have been going, basically. So here what you see during the 5th year following creation, so it is tighter, it's 5 years as opposed to 10. During the 5th year following creation of that site, Muni shall submit an updated tax increment financing plan to VEPC that shall include adjustments and updates of appropriate data for VEPC to determine, based on the financing debt actually incurred and the history of the increment generated, whether the percentages approved should be continued or adjusted to a lower percentage to be retained for the remaining duration and still provide sufficient municipal and education increments to service the remaining debt. So this is something that's done for TIF districts. The idea behind it is if you determine that folks are receiving extra increment beyond what is required to finance their improvements, VEPC can downward amend the retention percentage, assuming, and it is floored, assuming they still provide sufficient increment to service the remaining debt. So this is a similar provision, but it's a 5-year check-in rather than a 10-year check-in. And I would offer that this will also be in part tied to the size of your housing development site, because if you have a smaller increment generated based on a smaller site, you're gonna have questions as to whether or not you can downward amend your increment retentions and still service your remaining debt, right? But it's an empirical question as to what happens.
Can I ask, do we lose John at 3?
So I technically have a meeting in 3 minutes, but I think I will just wait until they email me to,
Where is the meeting? I can remember.
I actually think you initially sent me the invite,
I did.
but we've had so many emails today.
Oh, yeah, it's for another bill.
Yeah. I definitely want to submit an amendment to this. Is the rest of the bill, besides these sections, a lot different than what we sent them?
I can't speak to the remainder of
Yeah,
S 127,
so-
but I think the majority of work was in CHIP.
The majority of the changes are in CHIP. There are differences in the appeals, but I think Armin will probably go back to where it left the Senate. And then,
You mean
there are some other differences in the housing, in the,
Immigrant house.
This is just.
in the immigrant and citizenship housing,
Oh,
but
yeah.
they're modest changes, and I think we would want, I think we're working out which one we would want to go with. But I think other than that, they're very modest, other than this is the big,
I definitely
Game
support further proposal amendment, but I'd like to walk through the rest of the bill.
that's what we're trying to do.
Can I quickly hit the remainder of these? I think
Yeah.
I think it will be simpler to get through we've hit most of the big stuff, and then obviously we have the TIF sunset itself. But we come next to the information reporting pieces, just a handful of changes here. I'm gonna jump down to page 20. So we're talking about annual reporting that DEPC does to committees of jurisdiction for each project. New information here is subdivisions 5 and 6, expected or actual sale and rental prices of any housing units. 6, the number of housing units known to be occupied on a basis other than its primary residence. And then in section 11, you see an evaluation of the amount of public funds flowing to private ownership or usage. So just some new information reporting pieces. And yet, just to restate those again in case you're highlighting, subdivisions 5, 6, and 11 are new pieces. And then there's a light tweak to 9, which is, I think, consistent with what it already says. But this previously just said allocation of incremental revenue, and it says now including the amount allocated to related costs. Subsection C is your programmatic evaluation, your final check-in, and with the accelerated sunset in 2031, you see this being January 15th of 2030 for that final report. Note that in the Senate version, with the sunset proposed there, this was due January 15th, 2035.
So wait a minute, these dates are puzzling me. December 31st, I thought was the date we saw earlier where everything ended.
That's right. And this
So
is
why
trying
do
to
we have
get
a
you.
final report on a year before it ends?
So my view is they likely made a mistake on the year here.
It should be 32,
It should be 31 in this case. What you're getting is
and
a final.
December should be 30?
No, what you're getting is a final check-in before the sunset.
Oh.
That way you can evaluate if you want to keep the program. Like, the other way to describe the sunset is to force folks to make a decision on the program. So in the Senate version, the sunset is December 31, 2031, and the final report would be January 15th of the legislative session preceding that, so January 15th, 2035. I think this is likely it should be 2031, the final report. Otherwise, the content of that report is the same. And then I did want to draw your attention to the rulemaking section, starting on the bottom of page 21. Previously, we had just a subsection of your guidance section that authorized DEPC to conduct rulemaking generally. And now you have a standalone rulemaking section. It provides the same broad authorization for rulemaking, but provides 3 specific directives. So these are things that the council specifically has to do: adopt rules to govern prioritization of applications that take into consideration the purpose of the subchapter, vacancy or dilapidation, regional equity and verifiable housing shortages, and labor sheds. So they need to consider these things when they're developing their prioritization. Betsy also needs to determine the appropriate floor area measure for purposes of the project criterion. You'll recall that they said 65% of floor area dedicated to housing. They didn't say if that's gross floor area, usable floor area, right? There's different categories you could use. So Betsy's to determine what would be a good measure. And then lastly, supplementing the but-for test, giving due consideration to any rulemaking undertaken to supplement the but-for test that exists for TIF districts. So this is a way of saying, if you want to build out the but-for test more in ways that are specific to housing, you could supplement that through rulemaking. And these are 3 specific directives, right? So broadly, they have authorization to conduct rulemaking for this subchapter, but they have to specifically adopt rules on these 3 fronts.
What's a labor shift?
Areas where
same
folks are working, areas where folks are working. The genesis of this conversation had been proximity to job centers, and then they were hesitant to draw like a specific mileage between where someone works and the other. So they settled on this generic concept of labor sheds. Like
It's not so generic that we know about it.
Sure,
It
sure.
exists.
I know, but you don't really talk about, I mean, you talk about, and our state is so small.
I don't-
It's like the whole state is one big.
I'm confused how they're using it.
Yeah.
I mean, I will say that when it was said to me, I did not know what labor sheds were.
Or the state is a labor shed. I mean, people live in upstate New York and Massachusetts and commute to our
Right.
state, like,
Exactly.
silly.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay.
The guidance section remains the same, except that they pulled the rulemaking authorization into that standalone rulemaking section. So substantively the same. We do have an update to section 26. So we're now out of the creation of CHIP. You'll recall when I came in either last week or the week before, I talked some about a CHIP board. You don't see
Yes,
that.
we've gotten rid of the chip
Yeah,
board.
there's
thank
no
God.
chip board here, but there is a change that resulted from removal of the chip board and a continued desire to have housing expertise touching the chip application. So what you see here on page 24 is an update to the membership of Betsy's board. So at the bottom of this page, starting on line 19, exclusively for purposes of reviewing and approving housing infrastructure project applications under CHIP, the council shall additionally have 2 voting members, that's VHFA and VHCB, and as a non-voting member, Commissioner of VHCD. So 3 members with housing expertise that would serve on Betsy's board exclusively for the purposes of reviewing and approving housing infrastructure project applications. And I would characterize this as their backing away from the CHIP board and still wanting to provide some, right, this is the attempt to get some housing expertise touching this. In section 27, which is the last piece that I have to speak on, again, amending existing law. This is existing law for TIF districts. This is your TIF sunset. And it's at the very bottom of, or it's on page 27 at the very end.
I was gonna say it's the last.
The council shall only approve under this section applications for tax increment financing submitted prior to December 31, 2031. So same sunset as proposed for applications for the CHIP program, right? 31, and this is for TIF districts.
This is for TIF.
So if
and
not,
CHIP.
so this is just for TIF districts. The provision related to the CHIP sunset is in your section 1910. It's that final application date for CHIP,
Which was
December 31st, 2031, same date.
so it's the same.
Same date, yep. I just wanted to say that
Same
this,
date, different page.
this section is specific to TIF districts. That's all I wanted to make
Got it.
clear. And that is the full extent of the changes.
Thank
An
you.
amendment?
So why don't we update people? We've started to work on an amendment because I think all of our red flags have gone up. Is that a fair statement? First of all, pulse of the committee. Red flags?
The only question I have is regarding the auditing section, so whether the bill was considered either by the House, was the state auditor consulted to review that section?
The state auditor was provided this language. I do not recall specific directives as to change
Whether
this
anything came back
section.
as a
I know
result.
that the auditor had thoughts about the program,
Well, wait.
yes,
We know
but
that.
not specific to the auditing section.
Think about this report.
I was not asked to think about the report.
So you're here until you get an email?
Yeah, I think Megan went to check and see. what
Oh,
was happening.
okay.
Okay,
And
well,
then,
let's just keep, yeah.
Yep.
So,
and then you're free again at 3:45?
Let me check real quick. I think that is right.
At 3:45?
It looks like,
It's all good.
okay.
Oh, good, so we have you till
Okay.
3:15? Thank you, Megan, for whatever magic. Megan for magic. So, David, what was your question?
No, I don't have a question right
Yeah, you did, you just said no. But John's looking up.
What's it?
I had asked him his schedule.
Right, and 3:45, you're free-ish after 3:45?
Yeah, and right now I'm free, so let's,
Which is great.
Okay.
So I'd just like to check in and make sure everybody's sort of on the same page as the three of us are.
I don't
Because
support
this
it.
side
You
is,
might want to.
I don't support any of this. It's like a ton of red tape around a program that we want to build housing. I think this would be great if we had too much housing being built, then this
We
would
wanted to rein
probably
it
throttle
in.
that. But since I kind of want to do the opposite, I'd like to pare back a lot of what they put onto this bill.
David and Randy?
Same, I agree.
Randy? I mean, David?
Yeah, so I think this is an enormously valuable tool. It's being undercut. And I think that it's one of the undercutting notions that really bristles with me is that it's certainly focused on housing appropriately, but it's not focused at all on economic development, which I think is equally important as housing.
Well, they go hand in glove.
They do, but now we only have the hand, we don't have the foot.
Well, we only have 4 years, which is just a ton.
We're missing a lot of fingers.
Yeah, right, we're missing a bunch of acres. So that was our sense, is that we were all interested, and I think, given our time frame, we're hoping that an amendment, we could craft an amendment that would be possibly accepted by the other body, and we could be done. So in that vein, we're trying to craft an amendment that might be palatable and that satisfies our needs and the administration's. So Keisha has started this on behalf of all of us. You are lucky you didn't have any meetings. You didn't have any committee meetings. Which
Yes.
was great.
I know, this is my one job right now,
Yeah.
and my bigger job is hopefully to get us out of here with work we can be proud of this week. Because going into next week, I don't think will help us do work we are more proud of. So first I would say, I think to the point others have made, I think there are several sections that we can simply strike that are housing policy in our jurisdiction that were written by members largely of a committee that don't have housing policy jurisdiction. That includes the floor area restrictions. I would say to Senator Weeks' point, the eligibility for TIF, that's purely an economic development question. And there's nothing that hasn't been working to my knowledge about existing TIFs, so getting this specific is dangerous and not really important to Ways and Means jurisdiction. And the perpetuity requirements. I mean, that is to try and force monitoring of perpetually affordable housing that is also owner occupied at all times and not offered to anybody else is squarely housing policy and frankly government operations policy that would be very, very hard to implement. And that's not a revenue question, that's like
No, and we're
A lot of
trying
other
to scale,
questions.
and you're right, because we're trying to scale this to towns that may not be able to monitor in that.
Yeah.
In any
I mean, truly,
capacity.
even Burlington has a hard time monitoring Airbnb for, other rentals, but they have 600 employees and they have a hard time. So we're actually potentially trying to write something that not even Burlington could meet the letter of the law if we were to ask them to follow it correctly. And that is frightening and obviously something most of us, and I believe and imagine the governor, would not want to see us take a huge step backwards in terms of using this tool.
God, no.
So right now where I'm at is, we
So
didn't have
floor area, eligibility,
So- perpetual anything. Those
Perpetual
are
anything.
out. Those
Not
are out.
sure, I think it's all paraphrased right here.
Do we have that?
That's
That's from the government.
the administration.
Oh,
Do you wanna, should we let
Alex,
Alex?
Alex, why don't you- Alex, why don't you draw up a chair?
Do I have a
Join,
copy?
yes, here, you can have mine.
So why don't,
And Alex, if you have another one, I'd love it. There you go.
I wrote on
It's
mine.
mine.
Well,
I'll wing it.
Tom can look at mine.
You got it, we got it.
And why don't why don't the commissioner and I tag team on this
Great,
because we've
it's his
started.
document, so you wanna just introduce it and tell us where it came from?
I
Well,
only say in
sure.
the interest of time, I have a proposal for each.
Great.
Right.
No, that is written here. Like, yeah, to get more specific quickly.
Okay,
I
and just
want to be
introduce
clear.
yourself.
Yeah, that's right. Sorry. Cool.
Start at the beginning.
Alex Farrell, Commissioner at the Department of Housing and Community Development. Pinch hitting a bit here for VEPSI, who drafted this. So this isn't my handiwork, but I had a hand in offering my 2 cents here. So, yeah, I mean, these are just the important items. Thank you, Senator Weeks covering for me here. These are the important items to the administration. I've discussed them with, I think, just about everybody here at some point when I was able to grab you. But you've already hit on some key ones. For example, the but-for, we find a bit absurd given the state of housing right now. I also just want to make the point that the way you measure the but-for could be problematic because certain projects, perhaps, we have certain funding sources that may be flexible enough. So if you evaluate a particular project based on a certain but-for, it may not be able to pass the but-for because, okay, perhaps we could grab some extra money from from LIAC funds, from Treasurer P-check. Okay, perhaps we could grab this. So you could say, no, this would not happen but for this. Yes, because that's what we've been doing up until now. We've been finding ways to grab others. So when you look project by project, application by application, it's going to be very hard to pass a certain formulation of a but-for. This is why we've said statewide, we are meeting the but-for. Thus, there shouldn't be a but-for in here because we can't spread those resources around enough to qualify this.
But if we got everything else,
So,
could we live with the but-for?
so we're trying to then get something back to the House, knowing this is where they are.
This is
And
super where they are.
so, the commissioner has been part of a group of a diverse group of advocates, including Megan Sullivan, who did this before, so that's helpful to us while Jessica is at
You're
a
our
site
secret
visit.
weapon.
So I'm giving her credit in advance, but I would suggest that our amendment here just make all of these an or. There are a lot of different onerous tests that the but-for would have to meet, and it is all of them that have to be met, as I understand it. There's 3 different conditions. Megan, you look confused. This is where we're talking. Oh, okay, you're
She's
squinting.
following.
Okay. I
Serious.
was like, I hope I. So it was the but-for test. It'll take into account the amount of time and the proposed
What page?
additional,
What page?
8. So from page 8 to page 9, there is an and at the top of page 9, line 4. So you have to meet all 3 of those. And this is for little towns, little projects, little everybody. I would the simplest thing we could do is make that and an or.
Can I explain what one of the consequences of
Yeah.
that would be? The last of these, the sub 3, is really kind of that would be something you would think about in any project, right? So inevitably, people would just use 3 if you made it an or, because that's not even, it's just telling you, think about the revenue that's generated, how much is going to the ed fund, how much is paid to the uni.
That's
So just to offer that, you can change it to an or, but it,
That's kind of a basic one.
Well, then why did we have the other 2? I mean, I would just cut the other 2 out, but I'm not sure exactly what you're saying. I mean, they wanted to take these things into account.
you could strip out entirely that the review shall take into account specific considerations. It
Yeah.
could just be Betsy to review each application to determine whether it would have occurred or
Yeah.
would have
yes.
occurred in a significantly different.
So
way.
I was trying to do meeting something halfway, but I don't need to do that. You
No,
don't need
I
to
think
do
we
that.
could go right there.
That
with
would be
the
nice.
suggestion.
Okay,
So that
so,
would be line,
I would just strike from lines 16 through 11, basically.
through 11.
Yep.
So you don't think 3 is important?
It's not that it's not important, it's just that they're going to be considering, like, these.
Right.
You
They
should think
do this
about these
anyway.
factors.
Okay,
when you ask
that is a
about what
piece
Good
of
tests.
deal.
Yeah, great.
Great. I mean,
Less is more.
And-
Let's channel
And
Franklin.
I'll
Yeah.
offer that I believe Betsy this afternoon will be reviewing language that was used
Right.
in CRP as a but-for that they think also might be a good alternative to this.
right. So we have some middle ground in case we get to that point in the next however many days or weeks. But I think the best thing we could do is not pass something we don't believe in. And so if we cut that, great. I would say for the next section, similarly, the infrastructure eligibility, they made this huge list. Don't really know why.
Why don't we go back to the document we were?
That's what I am doing.
Oh, is
Yeah.
this the next one?
Yes.
Okay, sorry.
No, it's okay. So they created a huge list
Right.
of things that are eligible, making us all wonder then what is ineligible. VEPC can do that.
Right, they can do that on their own now.
So just use the sentence version, which was
Yes,
the definition, okay, yep,
TIF statute.
yep.
I think the increment retention is an relevant area for us to try and compromise with Ways and Means. I understand that they were trying to get at an incentive if you are doing their affordable housing project idea. I think we absolutely need to change those definitions and maybe drop the mixed income down at least to 15%, which is where most communities are with their inclusionary zoning.
Yes, I
And-
would parallel them with some.
Right, and I don't think you can't force perpetual affordability on entities that don't have the same access to HUD dollars and other resources specifically for redevelopment. That's tying the hands of most projects in areas where that just doesn't, they're never gonna get the resources to reinvest. So you're talking about then resigning people to substandard housing, frankly. So we could do something that redefines their mixed income, and I would change those words because I also don't think we should create new definitions that come out of nowhere. But essentially a 15% inclusionary zoning and time limited affordability at 85%, and the part that doesn't have inclusionary affordability at 75%. A point that I think is important when you're talking about these really rural projects is they're not going to be very big, right?
Yes, they're gonna be 15, 20 units.
Oh, 20 would be amazing.
Yeah,
Let's say
20 would
they're
be thrilling.
less than 10 units.
Yeah.
You know who got like a really good deal for their place and isn't paying the same amount that you are. And if we are doing this right, there isn't a huge income difference between those two people. You're essentially just saying you're on one side of a very limited AMI calculation and you're on the other side. And we, I think, have tried to wrap our arms around this as a committee, that the more you constrain one portion of a project, the more expensive it is for everybody else.
And our objective with this bill, in my humble opinion, is to incent all, not any particular, not just one subgroup. We invest millions and millions, tens of billions of dollars of state dollars incentivizing affordable housing and perpetual affordable housing. I think we just need to unleash on housing.
Right, and
This
this is the infrastructure, which is a public
Right.
good to build housing.
And it's a public good to build on.
Right.
Maybe it's a public good that enables one particular project, but it may be a public good that if used fully it could provide infrastructure for additional projects.
Right, we should be seeing this as a win-win-win where the state and the municipality have less money to build infrastructure than they used to. That used to be like what government did. And now the developers chipping in, but they're not trying to carry the whole burden, which makes things more expensive or impossible. So I don't know where that got lost elsewhere, but I would remove the floor area restriction. Floor area is not a good tool. It's just not a good tool.
So how, can I just go back to
Yeah.
the 1585%?
Mhm.
How do those sit with everybody? And I'm not sure, I'm perhaps a little behind on fully appreciating and understanding that, but happy to be brought along. But how does that affect our smaller, what do we think the impact of that will be?
So we had 80%.
Yeah, no,
And this is wrapping around that figure, recognizing that a lot of municipalities and like that affordable housing inclusion is more of a public good that people pay for in other ways in the budget. And then, 75% is still, that's gonna be hard for our smaller municipalities.
85%. But that's going to 15%.
sorry, I think there's two.
That you, it went 85% to 15.
I had 85 and 75.
Okay, 85%.
We would love to just, I understand that what's trying to be struck here.
Yeah.
I'll just say the administration would love to see the mixed income, projects that include mixed income at 90 and then all others at 80. But I also recognize you're trying to find a balance to make sure that some of those house members are comfortable. So 89 is what we would love, but if 75, 85 is what's palatable, then it's a lot better.
I think it's at least where we can sit with it for a moment.
Yeah.
So we,
Definitely remove the floor restrictions.
right.
And-
The cap, I mean, this again is where we should compromise with them. There was an idea floated at one point when the bill was somewhere that perpetually affordable housing just be outside the cap entirely, which that helps, I think, everyone. We want to be judicious about the amount of money we use on the education fund for housing that we don't consider necessarily the full extent of a public good as perpetually affordable housing. But we should really look at the figure of 40 million itself. That's, I mean, it's, in my mind, we could go in a lot of directions. We could use the number of cents on the grand list, not 40 million. So if they're trying to get at like 1 cent over time, I'm not really sure how they calculated that, but we should be looking more at the percentage of the grand list that we're willing
That
to
we're hoping to grow.
have debt against, rather than 40 million. That could literally, with tariffs and other problems in our horizon, be like half a project. We don't know.
So we don't apply these caps numerically to any other TIF project. This is,
We
to me,
use municipality.
so for me, I'm just having a problem applying this at all. I mean, I'm sort of agreeing with Jessica. I think that this ought, I mean, I have a real problem with this. It's so different from what we do now with TIF. And I think it makes it, complicates it enormously. So that's what I would say. I know it's a point of compromise, but I also think it's so not aligned with TIF at the moment.
Here's something that may address your concerns that we frankly wouldn't be likely to reach, which is meeting our housing targets. I mean, that's the conversation I'd like to have with the House, that the cap is our housing targets. That's
not, yes, and the more you meet, the more you can build.
Yeah.
The more you could be rewarded.
right. I mean, right now, otherwise what we're saying to our communities is, you have to build 2,000 units of housing in 5 years, Burlington. You have to build 500 units of housing in 5 years, Middlebury. Figure it out. Basically, like, we should be saying, and we're all gonna share the responsibility for developing the infrastructure to do that.
Right, so if that's what I thought this bill was in the first place, which is.
Might have been when it left
We're
us.
giving you a green light to go and build.
Right.
In thoughtful ways. So the more you build, the more you're rewarded. How do the caps fit into the more you're rewarded?
How did the cap?
They don't.
No, they don't. So I would
They
use,
don't.
yes. No,
So
it's a
I don't
rhetorical
understand
question.
why
Sorry,
they
I
are
didn't
used-
know the
So
answer.
I don't understand what they're used for.
Yeah.
Anyway, it's just a question mark, let's keep going.
So
because there's another
with
thing.
both the sunset and the cap, I think we use our housing targets. These are now officially endorsed targets,
Yeah,
embedded into the work of our regional planning commissions through legislative mandate. And I would like to see us really stay committed to housing targets that we set ourselves. I don't see us have this whole exclusively as a bona fide domicile in perpetuity. That's honestly really scary to introduce into into like, we're not even giving grants. We're giving tax capacity.
oh, you've already
Increment.
jumped down, okay.
Oh, sorry,
So-
yes,
so
the sunset.
You you scooted by removing the sunsets. I'm definitely support removing sunsets.
I mean, and I will say to, you know, fight for finances benefit, I think I was the first person to explain to Senator Cummings this morning that the House bill had repealed TIF entirely.
That's a non-starter.
Yeah,
Total
that's
non-starter.
like, so that's a no.
That's a poison.
We might link CHIP to our housing targets or our vacancy rates.
once we meet them, we could,
Sure,
And I'm
I mean,
happy.
like,
I'm happy to go with our version of it being a pilot, but not one that's too short in time. So, I mean, I'm happy to even look at it in 35, but I just definitely am not willing.
we had 35, but we
Sunset
didn't
in
call it a
31.
pilot.
That's right.
I wouldn't call it a pilot because the little municipalities that need to get their whole,
Right.
select board for
Okay.
like 6 years on board, and then you're like, oh, the pilot's over,
No,
it's.
It's a new program that we will be reassessing in
Exactly.
1830, whatever we're going forward in time, 2035.
I'd offer
I'm
that,
going way back in time.
I'd offer that if you tie anything to the housing targets, I'm trying to help Betsy out here, just say, it might be best to indicate that DHCD would provide the sign off that, yes, this community has still not reached their
Right.
2030 targets. Just so that Betsy isn't the one that has to go and look at the data to see how they met their.
Sorry,
housing
who do you
targets.
suggest right off on it? Oh,
We'd-
yeah,
we'd-
DHCD.
We reference that section of law on the housing targets. and
So just so I'm understanding, how are the housing targets being built? It sounded like you don't want a cap, but you were suggesting as an alternative, something tied to the housing targets. And then we also started talking about sunset. So are we just saying that the program has no cap, but will expire when DHCD has provided certification that targets have been achieved? Or is something else?
It's a question, we're being called on.
Yeah,
We need to
I
go
was
for,
trying
can
to-
we tentatively come back at 3:45?
I don't think I'll be available then.
Okay. Good.
can I work, we mostly discussed the changes.
Some of.
I would put VHFA and VHCB as non-voting with DHCD. I would create a definition of moderate income as up to 150% AMI, and I would do a JFO study
So,
on grand list growth.
Why
and
don't
buck
we
forward test.
regather here at 3:45 and just go through the rest of those?
Okay, can we work on the specifics now? Or you have to
Do
go?
you know what the situation is?
Yes,